Let's start with the dawn of agriculture. Daniel Quinn, who was a writer, he had heard about this contest. To this day, it's the one of the largest prizes ever given for a single work of fiction. And the basis of the prize was, can you write a fictional book that'll tell people how to save the world? Or he ends up winning it for a book called Ishmael. And the way he kind of describes it, he said, the world is, regardless of political ideologies, regardless of geography or anything like that, there's really only two stories that we have in the world. Are you hoarding food, or are you allowing food to exist freely? And that he divides the world into those two. And so you have totalitarian agriculture, seeds of grasses, and then we start to cultivate them. And so you see rice production, corn production, wheat production. And now, because you have food that you can hoard, you set up the infrastructure of civilization, which means that you have to have a standing army to go through food shortages. So then you have to build colonial conquest. And so you move out from there, and then you start to steal people's food. And so what we see from that is we start to see the building of massive population growth. We start to see nutritional deficiencies. We start to see all of this different stuff. But at the core of it, you're building a relationship with food that is adversarial to the environment that surrounds it. So insects then become pests. You start to see, like, any other herbivore that's coming in that's destroying your garden now has to be like domesticated and held onto. And that means you have to go to total war against anything that might come in and steal your food. And that's birds, that's pests, that's like pretty much any predatory insect, any insect that's going to, boll weevils, mites. And we build a relationship with the world and essentially terraform the planet to feed ourselves.
All right, today I have with me James Connolly, an artist, chef, nonprofit founder, and documentary film producer with Archer Gray Productions. He co-founded the Bubble Foundation, a nonprofit focused on issues of wellness and food insecurity in inner city public schools. And I believe Archer Gray Productions has actually worked with Michael Moore as well, correct?
Yeah, we did some of the financing for one of his films. It was called Where to Invade Next. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe my family is a huge fan of Michael Moore. Actually, we watched that documentary, so that was kind of cool to see. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason why we kind of like dived into Where to Invade Next was Moore can be kind of polarizing, I think, in terms of his political views, but this was a very sort of interesting film because it actually kind of, as a broad spectrum, kind of goes into some of the topics that we actually really care about. And coming out of the Bubble Foundation, which was primarily focused on schools and food and nutrition programs in inner city schools, what we found was, just even looking at the footage, just, skip through and look at the footage of what is typically fed to kids in France for a lunch. And I think it starts out with scallops with a curry sauce, and then moves on
Yep.
to roasted chicken parts. And
Yep. Yeah.
the guy's like, I've never served a burger in my entire life.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, that was
uh,
crazy. I couldn't believe that that's what they were eating for lunch. It's like I grew up in the States, so it was
right.
very common to just get the bland pizza with like the 1% low-fat milk and like some tater tots on the side. And I was looking at that going like, this looks like a 4-star, 5-star like restaurant hotel here.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and it was in one of the poorer districts in France. And so, like, one part of it is food culture, right? So France
Yeah.
has a very robust food culture, but the secondary part of it is they actually understand the link between nutrition and education. So it's not a particularly hard sell, I think. Um, Although I think France has kind of moved. I don't know if you followed any of the Nutri-Score designations that were happening in Europe, where they were
Mm.
essentially giving A to E grades for certain foods, and a lot of traditional foods like olive oil and chorizo and dried sausages and stuff like that. We're starting to get these um, D or E ratings. Even sardines, I think, were falling pretty low on the scale, and that's a sort of, even thinking about like a trophic cascade of where people eat, like some of the most nutrient dense foods you're going to eat are sardines. And so, it was essentially a perfect storm because the processed food industry can control and manipulate anything they want. They can add into margarine DHA or any number of different things. So McDonald's and breakfast cereals and stuff like that would typically score an A or B grade, because they can kind of change the functionality of their food to meet whatever the nutritional paradigm is to get people to buy more product. Plus, they're
Yeah.
in on the meetings. I mean, they're the guys who are determining what is healthy. Right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
That's very interesting. There's a website, you might know it. It's called examine.com, and they have like a lot of, it's a great database for anybody just looking to see whether X diet has this effect, and then the level of evidence for that. And I just
mm,
got an email from them. They just wrote an article on nutritionism, which is basically this
mm.
idea that you can just add nutrients to foods that are not nutrient dense, and then sort of you can hack your way into better health by just adding in like individual nutrients, which is essentially what you're talking about there with like the margarine and adding the DHA rather than just eating like a very nutrient dense can of sardines, right?
Yeah, and I think the problem with that is that it is it is one of the functions of the way that we study science, is that you actually study the things that you can study. And so there are a number of scientists who say that most of the synergistic qualities of food, we don't really understand. We call it kind of nutritional dark matter.
Mhm.
But we can kind of pull out tocopherols, we can pull out vitamins, we can pull out any number of different things, and then add them back in later on. But we don't really understand the synergistic quality of how food operates within our body. And anybody who's kind of telling you that they've got to figure it out is just lying to you. So
Yeah.
even within the diet wars, I think a lot of that stuff sort of is sort of coming through, because you start to realize that 90% of what they're agreeing on, can somehow they'll argue over the whatever the remaining 10% is. And so, like, for me as an outsider, somebody who actually really loves nutrition, who had it changed to a nutrient dense diet and fundamentally altered their you know my relationship with food and my relationship with, like, depression and any number of different things. There is a power to being an outsider to the nutritional sort of world, because they're really only seeing it from a very specific point of view. You know.
Were you a vegan at one point or plant-based?
Yes. Rich Roll's book had come out, and so he had this like kind of superhero character who, in his 40s, went from a standard American diet, um, to a vegetarian diet, and then excised dairy, and then started to run these sort of 23-mile, runs, and then in essence became an Ironman triathlete, and had done this thing where he had done. He wanted to do 5 Hawaiian Island Ironman triathlons, in a row. He couldn't do it logistically, so it was 5 over 7 days with him and a partner. His partner was a guy who actually had only one arm, so he was doing like open water swims with one arm and doing 50-mile bike rides with one arm. you know? And so it's a great book. I wouldn't trust it nutritionally, but it has all of the sort of like elements of that. And so, being a New Yorker, I was like, well, got to try this. I'm gonna, to start. I'll run from New York to California and meet him or something like that. But what ended up happening with me was that, and this is just what happens. Rich Roll probably can thrive off of the diet that he eats. I didn't. And so I would be having conversations with friends standing outside. And if the temperature was below 50 degrees, I would start shaking uncontrollably. I had no, like, I couldn't retain body heat anymore. And I had followed it, and many of the basic principles of it. I was diet combining, I was taking foods that are mixed together to try to get the right amino acid profiles. I was doing all of the stuff right, but it was
Hmm.
just my body was completely failing, total
Yeah.
brain fog and everything like that.
Yeah.
But I did try it. I mean, it lasted for, I'd say, close to a year. Between 9 months and a year, I'd sort of ambled back and forth. Towards the last 3 months, I just started adding meat back in, but I kept on trying. It just
Yeah.
was,
Right.
total failure for me.
Yeah, that's one of the crazy things that I hear from a lot of vegan doctors and influencers is if you didn't thrive on a vegan diet, it means you did it wrong. That's the kind of
Right.
narrative that I get from people. And it's like, people aren't stupid. I think people very much underestimate like the general public's knowledge in terms of like what's healthy. I think most people sort of like know what's healthy. I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of conflicting nutrition information, which makes it harder to understand like what is truly healthy for one person versus another. But I think this narrative
Yeah.
of like, if you this is the one diet that's best for everybody, and it happens on the carnivore side too, where people say like, if you didn't thrive on like a fully carnivore diet, it means that you were just doing it wrong. And I think like you're
Mhm.
saying, it's very individual. Like maybe, yeah, Rich Roll is thriving and he's doing very well, but other people may not.
Yeah, and I think that the thing about and we're finding, I think, in some ways in the carnivore diet, we're finding some degree of synergies between the enthusiasm that happens when you fundamentally change your diet away from the standard American diet.
Right.
And so you have all of the euphoria and the zealotry of that type of situation, right? So
Yeah.
you think it because it's working for you, and within our dietary system, because we don't actually have a diet culture. America is like the perfect storm for any number of different like dietary dogmas to kind of come in and fill the gap. We used to have a diet culture, but it was regional. You would have like places in the South and Louisiana and Southern cooking. You would have Germanic cooking and Swedish cooking in the North. New York was kind of a hodgepodge, sort of back and forth.
Mhm.
But as we standardized most of the diet in the 20th century, we kind of moved away from any degree of food culture. And so when you don't have one, it's easy to kind of fill that space with something. And you can, one of the things I find absolutely fascinating and may not, maybe for your audience would be kind of interesting, is that many of the things that are sort of playing out today in terms of the way that we're talking about diets have been around for a very long time. U.S. history is sort of like speckled with these people like Sylvester Graham, who invented graham breads and eventually became the graham cracker. John Harvey Kellogg, the sort of the religious ideologies behind vegetarianism in the 19th century. Then you start to move into the 20th century and you start to get Hollywood designed diets. You start to get this diets of purity that were kind of like sort of elemental sort of understandings of what humans should eat for any number of different things. There was a guy by the name of Bernard McFadden who was probably the first like influencer superstar.
Mhm.
Um, he had sort of a weird relationship. He like Mussolini loved him. He was a big proponent of fasting. He was a big proponent of vegetarianism. And he had this sort of idea of like building a world that was centered around this sort of like diet culture. And so he made millions off of that. He had a huge influence over the way that we thought about like the sort of the vegetarian idea of the sort of elimination of death, but as a form of power. He's a really interesting character. He's probably the first like superstar of diet culture. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's interesting. It's a good segue because this idea of elimination of death is something. So I'm I'm in Costa Rica, which is like the hub of veganism.
Ah.
And I'm very close to a
Oh,
lot
is
of,
it?
yeah, it is. It is. A
Okay.
lot of expats come here and they're looking for that sort of lifestyle of like all natural, all organic. And
Right.
part of like really the underlying driver of this is veganism, or one core facet of it would be veganism. There's like some cults like places nearby here that are entirely vegan. And yeah, they have this sort of fallacy that if you are consuming only plant foods, you are not responsible for death whatsoever. You are like clean, which as you go in on your Sacred Cow documentary that you produced is
Mhm.
entirely wrong. Where would you begin sort of talking about that more in depth?
Um, let's start with the dawn of agriculture. Right. So
Yeah.
it is sort of interesting because I think when you think about the world that we live in nowadays, Daniel Quinn, who is a writer who I have an enormous amount of respect for, he wrote a series of books that came out in the 70s. His entire career kind of started in the 70s. He was sort of I don't know if he was like an ad manager. He had heard about this contest that was put together, and it was, to this day, it's the one of the largest prizes ever given for a single work of fiction. And the basis of the prize was, can you write a fictional book that'll tell people how to save the world? And so you get this kind of first time writer. He ends up winning it for a book called Ishmael. Um, and it's an interesting book because it kind of talks about living in captivity, and it's told from the perspective of kind of an outsider. It's a gorilla who's kind of trying to teach this man the world that he lives in. So you need sort of an outside character outside of civilization. And the way he kind of describes it, he said the world is, regardless of political ideologies, regardless of geography or anything like that, there's really only two stories that we have in the world. Are you hoarding food, or are you allowing food to exist freely? And that he divides the world into those two. And so you have totalitarian agriculture that started in multiple different places all over the world, but over a period of maybe 12 to 15,000 years ago, we start to sort of move into the sedentary realm, where we then start to take um, seeds of grasses, and then we start to cultivate them. And so you see rice production, corn production, wheat production. And now you start to hold on to these commodities. You build an entire like relationship with those commodities. And now, because you have food that you can hoard, you set up the infrastructure of civilization. And so you start to build a patriarchy. You start to build like, a genetic response to patriarchy, meaning like the first son is the only one that matters, or you kind of build these lineages that are kind of based off of that. You start to hoard food, which means that you have to have a standing army, because you're not actually utilizing the environment anymore in a way that's productive. You go through food shortages, so then you have to build colonial conquest, and so you move out from there, and then you start to steal people's food. You create empire and armies, and just the entire sort of edifice of civilization is sort of built off of that. And so agriculture, in its way, kind of starts to build upon that. And we see it in some of the origin stories of the Bible. We see it in the sort of casting out from the Garden of Eden. So the Garden of Eden was a mythological, regardless however you want to tell the story, a mythological utopia in Eden, by which you can eat freely and have everything you want. And so you're cast out of that, and you have to live by the soil of your hands. And so what we see from that is we start to see the building of massive population growth. We start to see nutritional deficiencies. We start to see all of this different stuff. But at the core of it, you're building a relationship with food that is adversarial to the environment that surrounds it. So insects then become pests. You start to see like, any other herbivore that's coming in that's destroying your garden now has to be like domesticated and held onto. You see the pastoralism move into domestication, and you start to see a whole number of different things. But you build this fundamental relationship with the world. It really doesn't get going in the way that we kind of want to talk about the sort of modern agricultural movement, until we start to dissect what makes plants grow. And you start to get into fertilizers and pesticides and sort of mechanization of the entire world. And that means you have to go to total war against anything that might come in and steal your food. And that's birds, that's pests, that's like pretty much any predatory insect, any insect that's going to, boll weevils, mites, any number of different things. And so we build a relationship with the world and essentially terraform the planet to feed ourselves, And so, and some people will say it's a miracle, right? Because we were able to kind of like distill the God's knowledge in order to never go hungry again. Because that's the narrative that we're constantly told,
Right.
Regardless of the fact that like 1 in 9 people are food insecure on the planet. right? And we have 800 million people who are kind of living on the edge of starvation. We have the largest nutritional deficiency in the world is iron deficiency. We have multiple like deficiencies and all of this stuff. It's still the narrative we say that we're feeding the world.
Right.
And so that's kind of like an overview of it. The plant-based versus animal-based to me is it's not even a conversation. Like I don't even want to have that conversation anymore. I want to build a food environment that builds ecosystem function, that isn't at constant war with the environment that surrounds it, and also feeds and nourishes people. And so for me, the conversation is yes, we produce enough calories since the 1970s to feed the growing population of the world. We have done that. We have no impetus to feed more people, to feed the starving millions, because we have economic and foreign policy ideas about what that actually means. And so if you go into the sociopathic element of that, you say, well, if you feed them, that they're just going to produce more, and we'll have more unwanted people who can't feed themselves. And then you get the other side of it, which is, like so there's just all of these different debates around it. But for me, agriculture is the way that we've essentially terraformed the planet in order to feed ourselves. There for regenerative agriculture, um, the metrics for what is a successful farming season is very different, and that is, are you providing havens for migratory birds? Are you providing a soil function that allows for water to stay there, so that if you do have drought, the plants still have water to tap into under the ground? We, in the same way that we've terraformed the world to feed ourselves, we've terraformed most of our waterways to reduce flooding, but also to allow for safe passage of goods as quickly as possible. So we've moved meandering waterways and straightened them out so that when water does come, it's immediately pumped out of the system and then sent down through the rivers, and you get massive flooding, or you get most of it will get dumped out into the sea. So for me, like we need water. Our aquifers are being drained at astonishing rates. We're pumping groundwater out in order to sort of feed food systems that are total monoculture. So you get like almonds require on average about a gallon of water per almond. Same thing with walnuts, same thing with pistachios. Like you have all of these different monocultures that if you built a dynamic system, you would have a few almond trees, you would have, multiple functions on the landscape. The farming community would be like, you'd grow multiple things, you'd have animals on pasture, you'd have chickens, you'd have like all of these different things kind of working and integrated together. But because we built monoculture around everything, you can take these things and just drain entire like ecosystems in order to produce a product. So
Right.
I
Yeah.
think I've gone through like
Yeah.
close to 10,000
Yeah.
years
Yeah. No,
as
no.
quickly as
I think
possible.
so if I'm understanding correctly, then really when we first, and this is a really complex and interesting topic. I actually
Yeah.
had like a mini series on my podcast where I interviewed a bunch of anthropologists and sort of asked them what foods were humans designed to eat, which of course is like almost that question
Uh,
doesn't even make sense when I asked it to them,
yeah,
because
totally.
the sort of the understanding that I got was that we evolved to eat a lot of different types of foods, and then once agriculture came in, sort of in a way things started to get better, like you said, that we had like more like food security, supposedly, but then also we started to get like smaller head size and smaller body size, and our dentures, like our teeth started to kind of come in weird, and that comes in with the work of Dr. Mickey Bendor, who I had on the podcast,
Mm-hmm.
and the work of Weston A. Price. We also discussed that. So it seems like we did good with like sort of understanding how to create food for ourselves, rather than hunting and gathering, but we also created like all of these other problems in as a sort of side effect of that.
Yeah, and there's a really wonderful book that came out. It's called Charles Mann's The Wizard and the Prophet. And the way he describes he would divide the world into two things. Um, and there's always problems with dividing the world into two of anything, right? Right? Good and evil, like all of that stuff. But the way he describes it, he said the wizard is the person who always thinks that humans have enough ingenuity that we can always outsolve the problem that we created from the solution that we created from before. Right? So
Is that kind of like Einstein's, like you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it sort of thing, or not really?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the people that he's talking about are contemporaries of Einstein. And
Okay.
so you get Norman Borlaug, who kind of created the Green Revolution, which made most of our crops we heavily dependent on fossil fuel fertilizers and pesticides, but can grow them closer together. They grow faster, and they're much more uniform. And depending on the calculations, said about close to 2 billion people are alive today, based on the science that he was trying to solve at the time, which was famine throughout the world. The problem I have with Borlaug is that a lot of the famines they were looking at in places like India and Mexico were famines that were created by the sort of constant wars that we're having, the hoarding of food, and sort of
Mm,
the sort of colonial legacy of extraction from all of these different countries that were part of the empires that existed before. So he would look at was, I think, in his mind, kind of ahistorical. He was looking at populations of people who were living in famine, and saying, well, we have to solve this problem, without understanding that the famine was kind of created in a way. But so Borlaug is sort of the wizard. It's like, you're going to create problems, but we're always going to find solutions. We're innovative people. And then you have William Vogt, who is kind of on the other side of that. And he is sort of arguing that there are limits to the world that we live in, and you cannot exceed those limits. And so he's arguing any number of different things that I think most of us would find highly problematic now, because he's talking about population control. He's talking about um, conservation spaces for the world, where we kind of build these parks around the world, where we create these like ecosystems that are independent of human beings. I don't think there was ever any place like that in the world. So once we left Africa, I think we lived in continuity in some degree with most of the world that we lived in. Otherwise, we didn't survive, right? If we
right.
took too much, or didn't learn how to live within that ecosystem, we just wouldn't survive.
Right.
And you can see that in Inuit populations. You can see it in the Maasai. You can see it in hunter-gatherer populations around the world. Either they chose to live within ecosystems, or they just died out. And so you get the Vogtian side, which is always considered like sort of on the environmentalist space, and then you
Hmm.
have the sort of Borlaugian side, which is science will always deal with the next problem when we create that problem.
Got it. Okay, so it's sounding very much like on the sort of science side of things, that this is mirrored today in the whole vegan sphere, which seems like we're going to create meat in a lab, and we're going to create Soylent, and we're going to create Impossible Burgers, and we can always just like, it seems like the thinking there is that we can always innovate out of these problems that we're creating by, I mean, we're creating ourselves basically. I mean, we haven't even really gotten into monoculture yet. I do want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
But really, where is that meat coming from? And you had a great, I don't remember who it was that was talking in Sacred Cow, but they put it into a good context where they said these Possible Burger people, or these like sort of plant-based alternative companies, have done a great job. I think it was Joel Salatin. They've done a
Yeah.
great job of making it seem as if they sort of appeared out of thin air, as if these
Right.
like alternatives just kind of came here and there's no repercussions to them at all. And that's not true, of course.
Yeah, and I'm always very wary of people who will start to talk about statistics and efficiencies in that way. George Monbiot, who is a Guardian writer, and has written a number of different books. His latest one is called Regenesis. I actually spent a lot of time reading the other side's point of view on things. I think it's incumbent upon people who want to understand what kind of world we want to move into the future, is to sort of understand what I would consider to be sort of the opponent's point of view on these things.
Yeah.
His is mostly sort of microbial, vats that would produce these protein powders that then we could add in, water and any number of different things in order to make these pancakes. And in the future, we'll all live on pancakes. And we'll use the human ingenuity, the human ingenuity to take all of these protein powders and just make them into concoctions that actually look like real food. And so these microbial vats are kind of part of that, right?
Right.
The problem with them is that they're highly energy intensive. They require inputs, and so if you're talking about like you want to build a factory that is a completely sterile factory, there will always be cost to the environment with doing that. Whether you do it outdoors or indoors, right? Whether you kill everything on the land in order to produce soy, and then just add in inputs later on, like your NPK fertilizers, your mined phosphates, then you produce like pesticides to ensure that geodesic dome that we kind of like falsely create around the monocultures that we produce. His idea is to control that environment as much as possible. Well, the aluminum requires intensive mining. You're deforesting large parts of the Amazon to get bauxite, which is a total requirement in order to produce aluminum. You need to build these sterile factories, so you have to build energy inputs that are going to, to make sure that stuff stays sterile. What happens when you get what is inevitable within any ecosystem that you try to control? What if you get, something that kind of comes in that is like antibiotic resistant, microbials, inputs that come in? You just throw out that whole batch. Sorry, guys, nobody eats for the next 6 months, right?
Right.
This is inevitable, right? You can never create the perfect system. Maybe in space you could, but on Earth you're always going to get some degree of contamination. And then really for me it comes down to an element of control, because now you have these single input food sources that are kind of coming in that are going to be the perfect replacement. And we're just going to add in vitamins, we're going to add in minerals that are required. We're going to produce this stuff in vats, and then we're going to feed it to people. Well, who owns the property? Who owns the intellectual patents on it, and who owns the patents for all of that stuff? An Impossible Burger has, I think, somewhere around 23 patents. And so that is a total control of the food system.
Right.
So you have these people who are like, well, you have people who are saving seeds. You have these people who are like heroes, who are trying to create a food system that is based on plenty, that is based on, looking at the entire bounty of this world and what we can eat. Because really what we don't eat, like you want to talk about monoculture, like you're living in a time frame when you can go to the supermarket and you might get like 42 different varieties of tomatoes. When I grew up, it was one tomato. It was like one tomato. You had like 3 apples.
Right.
And, so like when you walk through the supermarket, what you're seeing is a bounty. We've been talking about a lot on podcasts. It's awe and horror. So like when I walk into a supermarket, I at awe at what we can produce, and I'm at horror at all the stuff we do produce.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And now you just like imagine the supermarket of the future where none of that stuff exists anymore. Or if it does, it exists to only the elites who are never going to eat this stuff, who own their own cattle ranches, who have their own organic gardens that are grown by people. And then the rest of the peasants are supposed to eat this like microbial goo. This is kind of straight out of the Matrix, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
If someone's hearing this and they aren't really sure, actually let me reframe this a different way. So you talked about how you don't even like to have the plant-based and carnivore or animal-based kind of debate anymore. And I think that you can't even get to that point without first talking about like how we even became agriculturalists. And then now it seems that because we've gone past agriculture and now we've gone to sort of an industrialized world, that now people are so disconnected from their food that they don't even know they don't even know how food is made. Like
Right.
a lot of the vegans that I've had contact with that are, because I won't say that like all vegans are just like I'm not saying that they're all like bad people or that like they're uneducated. There are a lot of very, very educated vegans out there that do well on that diet. But a lot of the ones that I've come into contact with that are just sort of very dogmatic still and very closed-minded, they tend to be from cities. They tend to have never even been to a farm. And they sort of have that ignorance, which is unconscious ignorance of how food is really produced, and the fact that, yeah, if we are to create these giant sort of monocultures of just wheat or just corn or just soy, we are sort of against nature in that, because we have to, as you said, insects become pests, and so do some birds, and so do some squirrels and things like that, and we have to kill them in order to produce your tofu or something. It's not a free lunch.
Yeah, and I think it does actually a pretty good job of it. Was the book called The Biggest Little Farm. It was a documentary film called The Biggest Little Farm.
Yeah.
He ended up doing an interview on Rich Roll, podcast, and I definitely think it's worth spending some time, because he is talking about, like, again, he's talking about water inputs. So avocado farming, any number of different things associated with the amount of water that's required in uh, uh, to sort of like to build these sort of monocultures where you're getting a constant product, and then shipping that product out, on a regular basis. But he talks a lot about, like, squirrels have to be killed, moles have to be killed, groundhogs have to be killed. Um, the way that he kind of describes it and visually puts it in is, if you have an integrated livestock system, if you start to get an infestation of, say, snails coming in, you then bring the ducks in. The ducks will eat the snails, and
Mm.
so you're sort of, at first, his farm is being constantly inundated with this new pest. They bring cattle onto pasture, then cattle are pooping out, what they do, right? And now you have these cow patties that are essentially breeding grounds for larvae, for flies to come in. So now you have this infestation of flies. Well, what do? You take chickens and you put chickens right after the cows have been on that pasture. The chickens eat all the
Mm.
larvae out of the poo, and now you've got dealt with that problem. And so, like, every single element, so nature lives in harmony. When you see it actually operating within harmony, you have predators will come in. I've been trying to think about this in a way that would describe what an ecosystem would work like, in in sort of a metaphor, or a story. And so, kind of like, follow me on this, like, little journey, right?
Yeah.
There's a brilliant documentary and a book that came out of somebody I interviewed a while back. It's called Serengeti Rules, um, and the way he kind of describes uh, the way that nature operates, you have predator sort of prey relationships between the food that is eaten and the food that kind of wants to get away from the thing that's eating the food. He describes it in a very different way, because the way he kind of describes what an ecosystem is that the actual predator to the ecosystem, and this is my interpretation of it, the predator to that ecosystem um, is the plant or the animal that will populate out of control if there is no predator in that system, right? And so, what they will do, if you say, the way he describes it, in the first place, is that he'd have these tidal pools in the Pacific Northwest, and so tidal pools are these small controlled environments that get fed nutrients from the sea at high tide, and then sort of like reversed in low tide. And so, when you look at that system inside of that tidal pool, what you'll have is a really diverse ecosystem of, like, sea urchins and mussels, and any number of different, like, sea anemones and all this other stuff. The predator within that system is the starfish. And so, what he does is, he said, "Oh, I'm going to do an experiment." And he takes all the starfish and he flings them out into the sea, right? He just removes them from the ecosystem. Well, what happens is that the one of those that used to be the prey takes over that entire system, kills everything else out, right? So it's an interesting idea because when you're thinking about it, you're like, all right, well, what is the predator and what's the prey? What you have is the control of an ecosystem by the predator's relationship to it. And so the predator controls that so everything else can flourish around that. And we see that throughout the world. We Part of the reason why it's called Serengeti rules was because so uh, sort of a bit of a history lesson here. Italy really, really wanted an empire, but they just weren't like, they weren't on par. Because you had like the Roman Empire, and then you have like, good 2,000 years where nothing's really happening, and then you sort of the building up of fascism. And so there's a scramble for Africa in the 1870s because everybody's looking for resources. And so you get Belgium goes into the Congo, you get Britain in South Africa, in India. You get all of these different. Italy wants to kind of get in on the program, and so they come over and they try to take over Ethiopia. They kind of get their asses kicked. So Ethiopia under I think it was Haile Selassie kind of pushes them back. And this was kind of a huge embarrassment, right? Because the West is supposed to be this sort of dominant empire, but one of the problems is that when Italy comes over to Ethiopia, they have every empire had some degree of quarantine that they would try to work out whenever they moved into a new landscape. Italy had decided to ignore that, and they brought over cattle that they had over in India and brought them over to Ethiopia. And what they did was they released a disease that had devastating effects on wildebeest populations plus cattle all over Africa. So you had this rinderpest, which was a disease that was at least somewhat under control in places like India, was then released onto a new continent, and it completely wiped out the ecosystem. This had been happening for a really long time, and wildebeest populations had gone down to an incredibly low percentage. And they had figured out a way to inoculate the cattle. And because they were able to inoculate the cattle, the wildebeest populations became inoculated as well, to a degree. And so what they saw was an explosion in population, right? And so you have this wildebeest population go from like a historic low of like 300,000 to 400,000 to 600,000 to like 800,000 wildebeest, right? 1.2 million wildebeest. And so they want to do total control. They want to control that population growth because they're like, well, what will happen within this ecosystem if we don't control this? They'll just eat everything in sight. And so what they wanted to do was like do these flyovers and helicopters and just start killing off enormous amounts. This one scientist who came in, he said, wait a second. Humans intervene all the time trying to understand a system that we don't really understand. He said, let's just see what happens. And so now you have this herd of 1.2 million wildebeest that are doing this annual migration, and they're being moved. So what happens when you have this food source that is completely abundant? Well, you get lions start to improve their populations. You get cheetahs start to improve their populations. They start moving the herd starts moving. And now they're taking all of these resources and they're moving seed in their poo. They're moving, because they're being moved, they're not eating, like the trees, and you start to see trees start to sprout up and actually grow into major trees. You start to see increases in baboon populations, giraffe populations. You start to see elephant populations improve. And so you have this ecosystem engineer, which is the wildebeest, that's sort of working with this new function and being moved. And so it eventually came back to some degree of harmony, right?
Right.
And yeah, and so it's a really interesting concept. And the way that we're trying to kind of like talk about regenerative agriculture is that we have to understand that these things kind of seek balance. And if we want to build a support system for a way that we can feed ourselves and nurture ourselves, we need to understand how those things kind of work within a larger like ecosystem. Are we providing habitats for migratory insects? What happens when migratory insects don't have a place where they can get water, where they can get nutrients? What happens when we confine animals to a small place? What do they do? And it's just any number of different factors that we just never take into account because we're always looking for efficiencies in food production. We have to change the metric to efficiencies in ecological function. And what we found was that the trade-off isn't really as hard as we would think, because we're still producing calories, we're still producing a total abundance of food, but we're also like bringing all of this stuff back to these ecosystems that we've degraded over a long period of time. And we can see what happens. We've seen those stories before. The Dust Bowl was a consequence of these sort of predatory functions of agriculture that just like destroyed ecosystems, move on, destroyed ecosystems, move down. And once we destroyed all of the sort of bison migrations and bisons, so the bison movement to control the population of Native Americans, all of those root systems were just gone, and we just saw the topsoil just pick up and leave. And you can see photos of it, the Dust Bowl. You can see photos of it just like 3 stories high, 30 feet, 40 feet, just these huge plumes of topsoil just blow away. And so and that's happening now in places in the Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, and all of that stuff, because we've started to move into growing wheat and sunflower oil and commodities and cheap stuff that we can kind of just make. So we're just destroying. We're just doing it all over again.
Yeah. We don't learn, do we? It seems like, so if I'm understanding correctly, then this monoculture, the monocrop agriculture is destroying ecosystems, it's displacing wildlife, whereas regenerative agriculture seeks to mimic ecosystems by basically, from what I can tell, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like we are the ones that are doing the leading the movement of these ruminants and these animals, and we're sort of in place of like the analogy you gave about the cheetahs and the lions. We're sort of like the cheetahs and the lions, like moving cattle around, sort of trying to sorry about the dog barking, sort of trying to revamp the ecosystem of whatever place we are currently trying to invest that regenerative agriculture in. Like I think, for example, in your film, you had somebody that was almost, I believe it was a desert. Actually, I believe it was in Mexico, Chihuahua Desert, who was using that to sort of rebuild the soil by basically becoming that, changing that predator-prey relationship there.
Yeah, and we asked for as much footage. He has a lot of like night vision cameras and everything like that. So he's bringing in like pronghorn antelope are coming back. He's starting to see, foxes come in. He's starting to see eagles. What you don't see in the film is that he's built this ranch that is trying to sort of push back desertification that's happening, where the Chihuahuan Desert is kind of coming in and encroaching, because you can't hold water on the land, then you can't really grow anything. And so deserts are kind of the product of not being able to hold nutrients and water on the land. And so when we talk about desertification all over the world, what we're talking about is, in essence, sort of like there's a scene in there where he shows like a ravine that used to have a cattle fence on it. I don't know if you saw that. It looks like the beginning of the Grand Canyon.
Yes.
It's this huge ravine, like 30, 40 feet deep. And that's a consequence of the water no longer being able to hold on to the land. So water is going to go where the least amount of like blockage is going to happen, and it carves out these spaces. And it can do it very, very quickly over the course of like 50 years or so. You can start to build these deep ravines. So what you're getting is a huge amount of water that's falling onto the landscape. It comes in these marginal areas. It's not like London where it's constantly raining. You get these sort of downpours. Can you hold that water on the land? And can you build back nutrition in the way that like ruminant animals, their digestive system is a compost heap. That's what it is. It creates a perfect microbial environment within its stomach that is a compost digester. And you had Peter Ballerstedt on there. He goes really well into sort of describing that. And they move nutrition from place to place. What these farms are trying to do is sort of mimic the predator-prey herd relationship. You kind of keep them moving over these periods of time, and because you can keep them moving, they can't really just overgraze and take everything down to its snub, so the grasses can't come back. Grasses are weird. They're I like to call them like the Lazarus plants, because you can kind of like really take them down to almost nothing, but provide the right ecosystem, and they have a seed bank underground. They'll come back. And we've seen that. We've seen that in many different places. We've seen you put animals back on the land, these lands that are totally just dry and arid and cracked. You put them back on there, they break up the seed bank that's underneath that ground is like, oh, wait a second, these conditions are perfect again. The cow has just peed, he's put nitrogen back into the soil. He's just pooped, he's got phosphorus and he's got nitrogen in his poo. We're going to take all of that stuff. We see that the right materials are for us to grow. And you see these 100-year-old seeds break open, and you see these ancient grasses start to come up, and it's so cool. And those grasses are very different from a lot of the ones that we grow nowadays. Because they provide a lot of ground cover and they can grow pretty big. Then you have ground nesting birds will find ecosystems and habitats to hide their eggs so they're not predated. Any number of different things kind of happen. And then you just see an abundance of insect life. Like we talk about dung beetles with enthusiasm, like the weirdest thing in the world. Because dung beetles will go into these like cakes, these poop, and they break it open and they carve these tunnels. And then now you have all of these other insects will go into that ecosystem within the poo, and they break down all of that stuff, and they feed all of those nutrients and resources back into the ground, so the plants can actually utilize them. And then you get the microbes and the fungi and all of these different things that coexist underground that'll hold on to carbon, that'll hold on to all of those sugars. They do all of this ecosystem function. And when you see grasses and you see trees, depending on the plant, usually about 10% of what we see above ground is 10% of that plant. 80% of it is coexisting underground. And so what I try to picture is when I see a tree, actually kind of what I'm seeing is the root system in reverse, sort of like a backwards element of it, because everything that is happening underground is so dynamic and just so different in many different ways.
There was this very interesting point in the film where a woman you interviewed said, I'm going to quote her here, she said, "Animals are going to die. The only choice now is to do it well. But are we going to be the death that's killing everything, or the death that is part of the cycle of life which makes it stronger?" Which I thought was incredibly powerful. And this was actually a funny story. I encourage everyone to go and watch the film on Amazon or other places as well where you can watch it. But this anecdote sort of came from a realization of this woman trying to plant lettuce in her garden. And she kept having these problems with the slugs who kept eating the lettuce. And so there came a point where she was going to kill them, and then she ended up not doing it. And then eventually she just ended up opting for a lettuce in the supermarket. But she never could forget the fact that there's always going to be pests or slugs or insects that are going to be eating it. And so she knew now at that supermarket, no matter what I choose here, there's going to be some form of death. So now the only way to do it is the best way that we possibly can.
Yeah. And Leah Keith wrote a book called The Vegetarian Myth. Came out years ago. She has been attacked. She's been threatened. She's had, people threatened to come to her house. She was attacked with a pie at a conference. She was a 20-year vegan whose body completely deteriorated. She did veganism right. And she's a sort of constant reminder of some of the demographics of what we were talking about.
Mm,
When you are talking about veganism, you are typically talking about people growing up in an urban space who have no relationship to their food. And that's what cities are. Cities are monoculture that don't understand monoculture. And so, heavily dependent upon resources that they know nothing about. And so, in order to build a city, you have to take all of the nutrition of the world and, in essence, funnel it there. I think the statistic is like New York has about 3 days worth of food if the whole system just completely shut down. You got 3 hours, 3 days, right?
yeah.
And so it requires water systems to come in, and it also requires that you take all of this nutrition in the world, the phosphorus, the nitrogen, all of the stuff that we utilize to grow our muscles, to grow our brains, um, and shuttle that to cities. And that's a hard thing for people to understand because like one of my first jobs when I was 18, I worked at a waste treatment plant outside of New York City. Not a sexy job in any way. And we would go to these places that were essentially digesters. We were just taking all of the fecal waste that was coming out of the city of what, I don't know, 8 million people. Like, just all day, all night pooping and peeing, taking all of that stuff and trying to make night soil out of it, right? So you try to make nutrition out of that so that you can actually feed it back into the agricultural system.
Mm,
And civilizations throughout all of history, up until the West started dominating it, actually did that a lot. You would have the cities would take all of the waste and bring it back out into the countryside. They would lay it out, they would dry it because that would kill all the microbes in it, and then they would put it back into the land and feed themselves. We divorced ourselves in many different ways from that,
hmm.
but it's not so far gone.
Yeah.
The British used to take back their dead and grind them up to feed themselves. So whenever they went to battle or went to war, one of the exports of those battles was essentially all the people who had died. And really buried them. What they did was they took all those parts and just made them into something that they could use to grow food again. And so, like, Zoe Harcum says it in Sacred Cow. She said, we should be eating them and they should be eating us. And she's talking about plants as well. She's talking about grasses. She's talking about the food system. Um, right. And it's
Right.
something we don't want
Yeah.
to think about all that much. Right.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah. So it is sort of interesting. There's a recent book that came out called The Devil's Element that goes into phosphorus. So in order to grow all of our monocultures nowadays, we need NPK fertilizers, potassium, uh, which we have in abundance, phosphorus, which is limited quantities, and nitrogen, which we have in abundance. But most of it isn't available to us because
Hmm.
it's in inert form. It takes up a huge part of our atmosphere, but we can't really convert most of that into something usable up
Yeah.
until like 1906, when Haber and Bosch figured out a way to convert it into ammonia. Um, and so phosphorus is, in essence, um, where we're getting most of that is two places. There are a few places in the world, but the majority of it is coming from Morocco. And the majority of the US is actually coming, I think 85% of it is coming from Florida. Now, what is that phosphorus? It's ground up bones and shells from other animals. And so we're taking all of that and utilizing it to bring nutrition back into the ground so that we can grow this food. Um, so it's really sort of weird to think of yourself as a vegan because you really couldn't grow any of those plants without those bones and
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
like the whole system would completely implode unless you
Yeah.
utilize that. Yeah, so and like veganism is, I'm never really the I think the original design behind veganism was trying to look at a world and say, we could build something better. They sort of hijacked, I think, a lot of the activism that was around environmentalism to push for something very different. But I never really like viewed them as much of a threat until the money started flowing in for veganism.
Mm,
And so when the studies were done on vegans from a marketing perspective, they were considered, and this actually comes from a vegan activist. They were considered on par with drug addicts. So um, highly intolerant, in your face, very judgmental
mm,
and moralistic. Not that drug addicts are judgmental or moralistic, but they were just like they were considered by many people to be like highly problematic in the way that they talked to people about
mm.
what they were eating. And so when marketers kind of got their minds around the idea of like selling this stuff, they were like, well, we can't really call it vegan. We're going to start to call it plant-based. And so you got these large form multinational corporations like your Nestle's and Unilevers, the Impossible Burger crowd and stuff like that, which were kind of startups. But you got Kellogg with Morningstar Foods. You start to get these multinational corporations that really govern our entire food system, right? There's about 14 in the world. It said that we were going to go and sort of move the world into plant-based eating. And that's where the rubber hit the road for me, Diana, and everybody that we interviewed on the film. It's like, you want to talk about the health implications of meat? Well, let's talk about ultra processed food. You want to talk about veganism and plant-based? Well, actually, what we need to talk about are these larger corporations that are utilizing their language and their activism to sell you an ultra processed product. And
Right.
that to me really is the diet wars. It's like, these huge multinational corporations that have been involved in child slavery, ecosystem destruction, genocide,
Mhm.
like total disappearing of activist workers all over South America and all over Africa. These companies that dominate and control every aspect of our food system have now built a world around plant-based, and they started to really push it because really, like, if you're talking about efficiency, what you want is you want to take animal feed and you want to feed it to human beings, and that's essentially what plant-based burgers are, right? um
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
There's a big misconception, and it's something that I hear a lot from a lot of the vegan influencers and even the vegan doctors, which is like, oh, there's no money to be made in this whole vegan plant-based thing. It's all like entirely non-profit driven, and it's like, really?
Mm.
Really? You're gonna tell me that the Game Changers wasn't like hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're gonna tell me that that didn't have financial backing in it? I mean, if we go back to your Ancestry Foundation talk about a year or so ago, you and
Mm.
Diana Rodgers were talking about how you made maybe like $4,000 from the film at the time, and Netflix was going to produce it, but then something ended up happening, and then they just sort of said no to it. So yeah.
Yeah, and for us, like, I, we had a sort of perfect storm of things. Like COVID happened the year that we finished the film. It happened that summer. We had tried to sort of like, so every single film festival was closed. We
Right.
couldn't even really get we couldn't get the word out. We had, I think, about 13 countries that had invited us to kind of premiere the film and to talk about it. All of that was shut down. So some of it was circumstance.
Sure. Yeah.
For me, like the so uh, the vegan-based documentaries are very different from the corporate entity that then took over a lot of the plant-based meats. Vegan documentaries, most of them are kind of be financed by weird sort of ideologies associated with it.
Mm,
I think if you look at the IMDb for a lot of them, what you'll find is like one or two people are constantly showing up. Jim Greenbaum is one of them. He is a board member for Mercy for Animals. He made, I think, close to $300 million in the telecom industry. And his entire life's goal at this point was to end animal agriculture. And so he is a primary funder of a lot of that stuff, and he's also kind of a information gatherer in
mm,
terms of like bringing all of these different activist groups together.
yeah.
um, you will see that with Eating to Extinction, which was another film, I mean, really just funded by Saudi billionaires, and like you know, like Richard Branson, you know, like the transportation billionaire, like the guy who
Yeah.
blows like enormous amounts of carbon dioxide so that you can float in space for like 30 minutes. The
Yeah.
guy who owns his own private island, you
Yeah.
know, like who
Yeah.
has naked girls like ride on his back while he's like on his jet ski, you know, come on, man. Like I don't
Yeah.
need those guys to tell me what to do in any sort of way. So it's always good to look into the financing of it. Most
Yeah.
of all of Sacred Cow is primarily crowdfunded. You know, nobody had any editorial control over who we interviewed or um, you know, we released most of our interviews in their totality. So we
Yeah.
weren't taking sound bites out of context to kind of push a narrative.
Right.
You can listen to Nicolette Nyman. You can listen to the entire interview if you want to. Um, for me, it actually matters a lot because, you know, for me, it really matters. I want to like build something that feels good to people. They feel like they're walking into a space. Look, every documentary is somebody's point of view, right? Like I am biased. Um, you know, everybody who's sitting down and created documentary is in some way sort of biased.
Yeah.
It's just the nature of gathering information. Um, but for me, it's like you know, I produced a film a couple of years prior to that. That was it's called Bloodroot, and it's about these two women in the '60s who sort of discovered the National Organization of Women. They became sort of like feminists and like left their loveless marriages and found love with each other and created this vegetarian restaurant in Bridgeport, Connecticut, like a very old industrial town that is not in any way like the sort of like Malibu, California crowd vegetarianism.
Mm.
And it talks a lot about like the long-term effects of activism because these women have been doing that for 30 years, just trying to make ends meet. So I was never like, you know, against the idea of vegetarianism or even veganism. I think you have to understand that there is costs, and it shouldn't really be. I think it's very difficult for me to get my mind wrapped around the idea of raising children vegan. Um, you know, because I think we see more often than not, like people doing it right who are failing.
Yeah.
Children are not. I don't know. I find it particularly difficult. Um, and I'm raising kids in the city. A lot of them will come home. They have other kids in the class who have decided to go vegan. And you know, for me, it's a conversation. You know, we're constantly like talking about the trade-offs of it and all that other stuff. But um, yeah, always a really interesting conversation.
Why did you because I'm assuming you sort of knew that there was going to be this pushback. If am I correct? Like before you even started with the film?
I think we knew about some of the history of people who had spoken out against the long-term effects of veganism.
Mm.
There's a website called I think the guy's name is Ben Hunt, and it's really just a list of all of the influencers who
Yeah.
used to be athletes, influencers, and a number of people, um, celebrities who were vegan, who quit,
Yeah.
and who essentially had monetized it enough. They had millions of followers or hundreds of thousands of followers, and some were discovered like eating fish at a restaurant and
Yeah.
you know any number of different things.
Yeah.
Some just quit and had to be honest with their audience that their health was failing. And so what you happens when you study those in groups, you'll start to see conversation flow from that, where they say this person who used to be an idol for them is now somebody who they absolutely despise.
Mm.
I think it was a celebrity singer who went on Joe Rogan who can't
Yep.
remember. Yeah, she ended up quitting, and just the vitriol that kind of came out of the vegan community because she just said, I just didn't, you know, I couldn't operate anymore.
Yeah. It
Um,
was, I believe it was Miley Cyrus, right?
it was Miley.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, so
Um,
did you, so you sort of expected to have like a pushback before making like the producing the Sacred Cow, like you sort of expected that from the vegan community.
yeah, and we got a little bit of pushback.
Yeah.
You know, I think if the film had become a kind of runaway success, I think obviously we would have gotten like people just trying to nitpick it and take it
Sure.
apart.
Yeah.
Um, it was never our intention to kind of, again, we were talking to farmers and we were talking to people who are, um, on the supply chain of food production, who
Yeah.
feel like, in many different ways that the business world they operate in is also being judged by a group of people who absolutely have no relationship to the food. And so
Right.
you get a lot of that stuff with vegan documentaries. You get undercover videos and undercover, like, any number of different things. You have invasions on farms, and then you have this sort of proselytizing the diet as the diet of endless youth and and virility. Like, I don't. You saw Game Changers, right?
I did. Yeah.
Do you remember when they did that whole burrito with
Oh
meat and the
God.
burrito?
Yeah. I literally couldn't hear enough about that. I was on a swim team in college, and once that came out, people just started
Right.
started doing that. And then I was talking to somebody who was like totally like enamored by this whole idea of the bean burrito and like
Yeah.
measuring the boners and all that kind of stuff. And he was just like amazed. He was just like talking about that like for months. But
Yeah.
yes, I do remember. Yeah.
Yeah. And uh, you know, yeah. I mean, who is it? I ended up going to a conference in LA, and that was their sneak peek of this new vegan documentary to come out. And they showed that, and I had to walk out of the audience because it was like Dean Ornish like
Yeah.
introduced it as like the
Yeah.
documentary that's going to change the world. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
like the thing. Um, I would love to do like an education on documentary filmmaking, like a class on it, because it is sort
Yeah.
of interesting. Because if you show footage of a thing and then you show something afterwards that is considered an effect of the thing, most people will kind of just fill that gap in themselves.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot with the way that kind of things are described. We'll see, people eating a burger, and then we'll show like hurricanes hitting, New Orleans.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was like, I could do that with anything, right? Like a
Exactly.
child on a tricycle, I could show a child going down, and it's sort of the butterfly effect, right? Like
Yeah.
a butterfly in Africa will cause a hurricane in, halfway around the world, because that's how dynamic systems sort of happen. But it is, I mean, it's such a trope of documentary filmmaking, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's
yeah.
and I relate to the fact that you probably have different reasons for this than I do, but the fact that this plant-based versus animal-based conversation is almost not even like something you want to do very much anymore. And
Hmm.
I sort of get that. I sort of started out the podcast being like, well, I'll talk to anybody. I'll just, I'll listen to anybody's point of view. It doesn't matter like what their opinion is. And then I'm sort of like at a point now where I feel like with some people, and I hate saying this, but I think for some people, you almost can't even have a conversation with them, because then it just becomes like a litany of like personal attacks, and
Hmm.
you're not even staying on the same topic anymore. You sort of can't have just topic by topic, subject by subject discussion on information and evidence, and instead you sort of it becomes a religion almost. It really does.
Yeah, and look, I am an outsider in a lot of that stuff, and I think that the more you go down nutritional rabbit holes, I think you can kind of end up in spaces where you feel like you've solved your own health dilemma, um, and you can kind of proselytize that in a way. It's hard for me because I don't necessarily like Jocko Willink. Or do you ever listen to
Oh
Jocko?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right? Um,
yeah.
he's got a new supplement, like a protein drink, and it's the cleanest protein drink you can ever have, and it's going to be the best chocolate you're ever going to have, and you're going to be Jocko. And I'm like, wait a second, Jocko wasn't Jocko when he was doing that. He didn't drink any
Yeah,
of that junk.
yeah, yeah.
And so like, there is an element to the way that we have to monetize everything,
Sure.
in from an information source, in
Yeah,
order to live, right? We live in a
right.
capitalist society, and you have to be able to go and take something, and you want to put out as much information as possible without saying that it's governed by this, that, or whatever. There are are a number of different elements that we've seen just in the agricultural space. The level to which pesticide companies like Monsanto have really governed most of the conversation about sustainability and the ecological consequences of their stuff. We have seen, if you study enough of the history of the way that the sugar industry was able to co-opt a lot of the science around heart disease to be able to sort of scapegoat a number of different things like saturated fats and cholesterol,
Right.
you start to see, same thing with vegetable oils. We see the same thing with Crisco. We see the same thing with the birth of margarine. uh, we see these entities that create these really low cost, like nutritive value foods,
Yeah.
be able to, in essence, sort of govern the entire topic of the conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's really hard to sort of distill all of this stuff down to like any number of different things to give somebody a diet that's going to work for them. Jesus, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Right.
um, it is really, really difficult. Like, I walk through New York City, everybody's just sucking down oat milk all day long.
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And meanwhile, we have like dairies like going out of business in upstate New York. I mean, local food. You talk to people about local food, they're like, yes, amazing. I love local food. I'll go to the farmer's market. I'm like, where are those oats being grown? Like where
Yeah.
is it being shipped to? Any number of different factors are kind of associated with it. And look at, oat milk is a glucose spike on a level that like is candy, right? So
Right. Yep.
you're being told this thing is like the best thing you're going to have, eliminate dairy, it's associated with blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But here I have this like immediate emulsified glucose shot that you can put into your body in the morning. It's gonna
100%.
lighten up your,
A hundred
your
percent.
senses.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? I mean, there's there's a ton of stuff that we covered that are problems, but where does somebody go from here?
Well, I mean, I think the podcast space has been enormous. Whatever you think of Joe Rogan, or the number of people who've born out of Joe Rogan's sort of ecosphere, there has been enormous push for building a food system that is sustainable.
Yep.
I do people think that people are genuinely frustrated with authority. They're frustrated with people who told them for 50 years to just eat the margarine and, 5 servings of grain a day, and then blaming the consumer at the end part of that because they can't control themselves around the most obesogenic food system ever created. They're genuinely frustrated with all of it. They're just looking for answers. And I think the podcast space has actually done an incredible job of being able to bring people in to a long form discussion about a subject that you consume 3 times a day, and it can either be the most amazing nutritive food that's gonna like bring fertility and joy and all of that stuff, build a food culture, all of that, all of the things that are kind of part of the ecosystem of food, um, you know uh, that they can build something around. And I don't think we could. I think we've underestimated the amount of work that has been done by some really key drivers of this whole conversation to push back what these guys thought was absolutely inevitable, that we're going to move towards a plant-based food system. We've seen the stock of all of these companies go down. We've seen product launches from Kellogg's just immediately shelved. We have seen any number of different Impossible Burger stock, Beyond Meat stock has gone down. Um, every single element of that is fundamentally failed. And the activism that was coming from people who were outside of that system, like whether it's the carnivore movement or even just like land activists who are fighting for smaller hold agricultural systems, were like, wait a second, this whole vegan mythology is just bullshit. So I think we have seen a real sort of paradigm shift. I would love for it to get more out to general culture. Um, but the problem that I have was that I don't think people know the leverage that food can have on all of the things that will then become a part of their life and lifestyle. Um, I think it's the main lever for change for people. They want to get healthy, if they want to like, be able to, just control any number of different functions from like, depression and, like all of that stuff. The thing I've been mostly sort of reminiscing about lately is just the level to which like we've destroyed so many aspects of our body for like the sort of contemporary culture thing, like shoes, right? Like barefoot running, like the
Yep.
the degree to which Nike destroyed the human body, because I've been thinking about it a lot. Phil Knight, Phil Knight, the
Mm-mm.
that book that came out, Shoe something or other. It was like a big bestseller. It's about the origin of Nike and how they like glommed onto Michael Jordan and then kind of created the Nike empire.
Mm.
But single-handedly, Nike was the one who kind of like functionally changed the way that feet operate when running,
Yeah.
and pushed it all towards heel strike,
Right.
and destroyed people's bodies, their
Yeah.
knees, their like total sort of cascade
Yeah.
on the foot. And so I've been thinking about that a lot for whatever reason. But like
Yeah.
food becomes the lever by which you start to think about culture in a very different way,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm definitely more well versed on the health side for that. And I do think that I think there's few people that would argue that nutrition is almost more important than diet. If you had to choose one or the other, I think it may be more important than exercise.
Oh yeah.
Just because, for example, they've done studies on the Hadza where they've strapped these calorimeters to them, like just to see the oxygen and CO2 exchange, just to measure how many calories they were burning. And initially, they sort of hypothesized that, oh well, they're sort of running and walking for miles and miles and miles every day. It must be that they're so lean and metabolically healthy because of all this activity they're doing.
Right.
And they found out that it actually they still burned the same amount of calories that a person working a 9 to 5 desk job burned. So that tells us that it's not exercise, at least not cardio really, that's the lever to sort of get us into better health. It's really the foods that we choose to eat. So I agree with that. If the general public wanted to get more involved in sustainable food production, where would you recommend people go to learn more about that? Obviously, your documentary Sacred Cow is a great resource for that. Where else?
Um, yeah, I mean, it really depends on what sort of brings you into it. I think when you talk about people being sort of moved into veganism, typically health will be one of the first levers for them.
Mm,
They will start to build a relationship around like the environmental argument or anything. You have to sort of figure out the thing that you care about. Because
mm,
if you want to build something that is going to be like a lifestyle change for yourself, I think you have to give yourself a why, like why you're doing this.
yeah.
Um, somebody had just made a great point, that if you wanted something akin, the closest thing that we have today that is akin to an old McDonald's nursery rhyme idea of a farm, cattle ranching is really the only one that's actually left. you know so what you see in a lot of vegan documentaries of these huge sort of finishing barns, is where cows will spend the last like third of their life, and that's to fatten them up,
Mm,
for slaughter.
yeah.
What
Yeah.
typically happens is two-thirds of their life is still on pasture. They still live within an ecosystem that they are closely adapted to. Chickens, we've monocultured the hell out of, and obviously pigs as well. They're, depending on where you are, always very difficult. I never want to shame people to buy food that they can't afford. And so start to bring meat back into your diet if you've excluded it for a very long time. Even if you get it from Costco, I'm not going to shame you for that. I just think you have to do what's best for you at first. The I loved what Peter said about some of the elements that are kind of part of the way that we sort of measure diet in terms of its the our financial ability to sort of afford an affordable diet,
Yeah.
because we don't really factor in the medical related costs, and all of the other costs of like, you know, sort of varying weight gain and clothing and,
Yeah.
you know, medical related. If you're going to get sick today, it's going to be a metabolic disorder related to food, I think, for the most part, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, and so start to sort of factor some of that stuff into it. You know, we know what a healthy diet is. Between you and I, it's meat and veg, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Fruits, you know, like go for it. I don't necessarily like have a problem with fruits. I think we know what a healthy diet is.
Yeah.
I try to exclude the rest of that stuff just because there's just so much associated with it.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, what was your question though?
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
like, oh,
so other
yeah. So,
resources that people
yeah.
can learn from. Yeah.
So cattle production in the US actually is still in every state. It's one of the weird sort of like kind of localities that kind of happen. You can go all the way from, you know, southern Florida all the way up to Alaska, and there's still cattle production, which I just find is kind of amazing.
Hmm.
Um, you know, in every state in the country. It is worth it to kind of start to build a relationship with a farmer if you can.
Yep.
You know, it's going to cost you a lot less if you, you know, can buy a quarter cow or half a cow.
Hmm.
Um, YouTube is probably the most amazing resource in the world if you actually use it for what it was intended for. Learn how to slow braise something. Learn how to cook, like, you know, learn how to use knife skills, and ask it questions that you just don't know the answers to, you know.
Hmm.
Learn how to cook, dude. If you're a guy, fucking learn how to cook. Jesus Christ. You know? I don't have time for it.
Yeah.
You know, it's absolutely ridiculous, and it's the barrier for change is not that hard. I really, really believe that, like, there, when you're controlling for taste, salt matters a lot. When you're controlling for what is satiating, French chefs have said this for 100 years: fat equals flavor. And so, like, don't necessarily be as afraid of fat. Get the cheaper cuts of meat. You know, like all of that stuff. Start to incorporate like the rest of the animal. You don't have to live off a ribeye, Sean Baker.
Yes, 100%. That's exactly who I thought of as well. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, but like
Yeah.
I know what he was doing. He was just trying to prove a point, you know.
Sure.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, there are whole parts of the animal that people don't touch that I
Hmm.
find absolutely fucking delicious.
Yeah.
You know, and then, you know, just stuff like that. And, you know, any change that's going to happen at home is going to take a little while, but get used to uncomfortability. You
Yeah.
know, like
Yeah.
the world wasn't, you know, it's not really set up to give us everything we want whenever we want it, and there's a
Sure.
cost to that, I think.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where would people go if they want to find out more about you and your work?
So, so after Sacred Cow, I decided I was not going to do documentaries anymore because I just found like I was competing with like aliens built the pyramids and like, you know, whatever, like singer songwriter documentaries, and I was like, guys, all of this doesn't matter if we can't fucking feed ourselves. And so I decided,
Yeah.
like, it doesn't matter. Shakespeare doesn't matter if we can't feed ourselves.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So so I decided not to, and then I found this really ragtag group of like amazing young filmmakers, and we've been working on a new film that is in production now. That'll take a lot of the stuff that we kind of talked about in Sacred Cow, and then just
Hmm.
completely just like build an entire uh, civilizational story around it. So that is called Death in the Garden.
Okay.
You can look that up. Jake and Marin are the directors and producers on it. I'm producing it as well. Um, and then if you want to reach out, Primate Kitchen on Instagram is probably the, like, you know, the one that's I'm most active on. Twitter, I am at my absolute worst self. So I can't. It's so, you know, there's just something about the algorithm.
Yeah, you know what?
You
I
know,
was I
just
was listening to a podcast with Lex Friedman and who was it? Who was it? Sam Harris. And you know Sam
right.
Harris is this he's come under fire recently, of course, with his political
Again.
comments. Uh, yeah, right. And so he obviously he's this like very spiritual and educated person, but they talk about how Twitter sort of turns almost anybody into just like a horrible person. Like it's
Yeah.
rare where you see somebody that's just like can sort of control themselves on Twitter based on like the algorithm and the emotion provoking comments and like the bots and the trolls and all that kind of crazy. I don't even touch Twitter, to be honest. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, but I'll include all
Yeah.
those links in the show notes for everybody. Check it out.
Cool.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. All right, amazing. Thank you so much, James, for your time.
Yeah. Pleasure. Pleasure.